forth between the city and Falck was that the fire department would maintain medical control. So in any way that there was a disagreement in care, that ultimately the fire department's decision would be the one that would be performed.
I see. So is it fair to say that Aurora Fire, when they're present, they're the ones that call the shots on the medical decisions?
Correct.
And is this for the entire city of Aurora?
Within the response district of the fire department, yes. If Falck was responding to another out for mutual aid, so aid at a request for service, a transport service to either like South Metro or Denver, for example, typically the those mutual aid agreements depend, and I can't speak for certain if those if it was different between the two anymore. But typically, whomever arrives first typically maintains the care, and then once the person is transported, the attending paramedic would have medical control.
I think we touched on this a little bit, so I apologize. Can you talk to us about your familiarity or your relationship with Phelps protocols as well as Aurora Fire back in 2019?
Could you rephrase the question a little bit?
So I apologize. Can you talk to us about your familiarity with the Phelps protocols back in 2019?
I would consider myself familiar. Yes.
Okay. I mean, I guess, is there a set of duties or obligations you had as a clinical coordinator regarding?
I was not directly involved in the development of specific protocols. I did help design protocol tests that would test the knowledge of Falck personnel.
I see. What about trainings?
So my job was to take the direction of an identified educational need or opportunity, develop a training whenever that was done in collaboration with the clinical manager as well as the medical director. And then whether that was seen beyond other people, I'm not really sure, but it was developed and then approved prior to any sort of deployment.
So were you responsible for helping develop and implementing the training for Felk?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would move to qualify Mr. Chambers as an expert in the area of paramedic roles, protocols, and training.
All right, the court will allow the witness to opine in those areas and specifically with respect to Falk Ambulance.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Chambers, can you talk to us about the relationship between the medical director and the paramedic? I believe we had touched upon that a little bit, but I'm still a little bit confused in terms of the freedom a paramedic has and what guidelines the medical director provides.
So in so in terms of protocols, there are standing orders. So the protocols will specifically stipulate what's a standing order and what is not a standing order. So in the way that the Denver Metro protocols, which Aurora and Falck operate under a version of the Denver Metro protocols, it'll specifically state the indication, the description of either a procedure or a medication, indications, contraindications, special considerations, dosing, and other such things. And if it is not a standing order, it will specifically state that it is a call-in, and then it will state what the desired call-in, either dose or request, should look like.
Okay. So this is all by the authority of medical director.
Yes.
You mentioned that you were in charge of the trainings for the paramedics with Falk.
I was in charge of delivering those educations.
Sorry. And developing, is that fair?
Assisting with development, yes. So I would create a draft, and then that would be collaborated upon with others to ensure.
In your trainings, I think you had mentioned that Aurora Fire has medical control. So at your trainings, do they include protocols that Falk employees should be recognized? So let me rephrase. In your trainings, do you teach that Aurora Fire has medical control?
It is an expectation that throughout there should, let me phrase this the appropriate way. It should be an understanding that each individual working for Falck Rocky Mountain has an understanding that Aurora Fire has medical control.
Great. In your trainings, do you teach that law enforcement is not in charge of medical decisions?
At this time, that was not specifically mentioned to my knowledge in any trainings.
In 2019, is it fair to say that when medical provider arrives on, or I guess, do you teach that when a medical provider arrives on scene, the paramedic is now in charge of medical care?
Or response?
Judge, I think this goes towards all of Felk's trainings.
Um, I'll sustain the objection based on the form of the question.
Okay, I can rephrase. Let me actually come back to that. I want to focus on this specific area of ketamine training. Are you aware of when ketamine was approved for Felk's use?
I do not recall the specific date of the approval of the waiver.
Okay. Were you with Felk at the time that ketamine was approved?
Yes,
If it was around 2018, 2019, does that sound about accurate?
roughly, yes.
Are you familiar with when ketamine was approved for Aurora Fire and Rescue's use?
My understanding of the waiver was that it was a joint waiver for both agencies.
When you're talking about waiver, can you very briefly describe to us what you mean by waiver?
The waivering process is a process where an agency requests to utilize a medication that is not within the standing protocols established by the state, but as approved nationally for various reasons. It's meant to restrict usage of specific interventions or medications to very specific and controlled and heavily data collected interventions.
I see. And are there a lot of rules and restrictions when we're talking about a waiver?
Depends on the waiver. So I can't speak to that exactly.
Sure, fair enough. In this scenario, was the medical director, Dr. Eric Hill, in charge of obtaining that waiver?
It would have been a joint process between the requesting agencies on who sponsors the waiver, but he would have been a party to it, yes.
Is it fair to say in 2019 that ketamine was still new for Felk?
I mean, it would depend on when the education was delivered and what you're defining as new.
Okay. Within the past year?
My understanding of, depending on the time when the education was delivered, then yes and no.
Okay, fair enough. Was it fair to say then about that same time frame for Aurora Fire?
Yes, they would have, the education was delivered jointly, so.
In terms of specific ketamine waiver, if you know, did that come with a lot of restrictions and requirements?
How would you define those restrictions and requirements, I suppose?
Were there mandates by the state in terms of what protocols must be followed in order to use ketamine?
The state has, when you apply for the waiver, you have to, in the part, a part of the requesting process outlines what indications, indications, contraindications, dosing, and so on, you're going to be utilizing, and that has to fall within the state's comfortability.
Perfect. And so they had to approve the specific dosage and the specific, I guess, follow-up care in order to use ketamine. Is that fair?
Yes,
And that happened for, I guess, did that happen for the ketamine waiver?
I would imagine so, yes.
Were you, as clinical coordinator, in charge of training Felk employees on those protocols?
Yes,
Did you put together a ketamine training for Felk employees?
as a collaborative process, yes.
And when putting together this training for Felk employees on how to use ketamine, did you ensure that this training was also used for Aurora Fire?
I was requested to deliver that education to both parties, yes.
So did you personally deliver the training
Yes,
to both Aurora Fire as well as Felk?
yes,
And am I to understand that this training was prior to the ketamine actually being in use?
yes.
So sort of a, hey, this is coming down the wire. You guys need to know the protocols in order to use ketamine.
Correct.
Did the training materials regarding ketamine go through a vetting process with the medical director?
Yes.
Was it your responsibility as well as, I guess, was it a part of a collaborative effort to ensure that all the training protocols, all the trainings comply with the protocols and the mandates by the waiver?
Yes. The education was not delivered without the approval of both my manager and the clinical director and the medical director.
And in terms of this training, did it go through the dosage requirement before an employee of Falck or Fire would be allowed to use ketamine?
Yes.
Did it go through the dosage restrictions in terms of what the maximum dosage was allowed?
To the best of my knowledge, it should include what the maximum dose is. Yes.
In terms of the training materials, did it talk about what the state mandates in terms of an assessment and follow-up care if ketamine is used?
I would have to review. I don't want to commit myself, but I would hope so.
Fair enough. Um, Your Honor, may we show the witness only? Uh, Discovery Bait Stamp 3332.
You may.
And Mr. McCrae, can you please slowly scroll through those? Um, oh, still there. Mr. Chambers, is this what you have in front of you, is this the training that you put together for Fel?
Yes.
Is this the training that you taught for Aurora Fire?
Yes.
And was this the training that was taught prior to Falck and Aurora Fire being allowed to use ketamine?
Yes.
At this point in time, Your Honor, defense moves to admit this, and I think I'll label it G as in good.
Questions or objections with respect to G?
Relevance and foundation relevance as to
Response?
Judge, I'm happy to respond. Does the court want me to do that here or up there?
You're welcome to come up.
Thank you. Uh, Mr. Chambers, prior to an employee of Felk using ketamine, are they required to understand the protocols required in order to use ketamine?
They're required to have comprehensive knowledge of all protocols.
Um, Prior to an employee of Felk using ketamine, are they required to undergo the training you put together for ketamine?
I know they were required at the time before anyone started in terms of how that looked for people who were hired after the in-service date. Uh, the education was available to them, but I can't speak to each person receiving that education, as I was not the one in charge of making sure it was delivered to them.
Certainly. The ketamine was not in use in 2018, correct?
Yes,
And so employees in 2018 for Falk would have to undergo these protocols and trainings to know how to use ketamine before they're allowed to handle it. Is that fair?
all paramedics.
All paramedics, even paramedics handing ketamine to, say, an Aurora Fire Department.
All paramedics who were employed at the time who hadn't will have had to receive the education before being able to deliver it.
And we're talking about this education that's in front of you.
Correct.
Judge, at this point in time, defense moved to admit Defense Exhibit G.
All right, objection to Woodyard.
So Mr. Chambers, literally just a couple questions. I heard you say that you can't speak to whether each person individually received this training that we're talking about. Is that accurate?
In terms of well, no, I cannot specifically state that every individual employed at the time would receive this education between both agencies. I don't have those training records, and the training records for Falk and for Aurora Fire are kept by the respective divisions. So
And then I also heard you say that specifically if somebody was hired after this in-service was conducted, that they might have had access to it, but they wouldn't have necessarily gone through this training?
they would have not, I cannot say that they specifically would have, they did not receive the training directly from me, no.
Those are the only questions I have. Same objection, Your Honor.
All right. Response.
Judge, I believe Mr. Walker testified that he began Falk in 2018, which is prior to the implementation of ketamine.
All right. As it has to do with paramedic Walker, the court will find that there is sufficient foundation for his training, and the objection will go to weight versus admissibility
Thank
with
you, Your Honor.
respect to him.
Your Honor, at this point in time, may I please publish Defendant's Exhibit G?
All right.
Mr. Chambers, in terms of your role as a clinical coordinator with Aurora Fire, we mentioned that you put together a training on the protocols for ketamine before it's implemented, correct?
Working for Falk, yes.
I'm sorry, working for Falk, long day. And so you worked under the guidance, or I guess in cooperation, coordination with the medical director to make sure that these trainings followed the protocols. Is that fair?
The presentation was approved by the medical director, yes.
Perfect. And you had mentioned that these protocols, given that it was a joint ketamine waiver, were similar for Falk as well as Aurora Fire.
To the best of my knowledge.
And you had mentioned that this training was given to both Aurora Fire as well as Falk before ketamine was even employed.
Correct.
I got 1 second, Judge. Judge, may I approach? And last, one of my final questions in terms of this training, you mentioned when providing it to Aurora Fire, that was to all the paramedics for Aurora Fire as well, correct?
The design of the in-service education is that each crew attends, so that each individual person would attend. I cannot verify that every single employee attended, because again, the fire department is responsible for maintaining those records.
Sure. And the whole purpose of this training is to ensure that they're aware of the, is it fair to say?
Sustain.
I can rephrase.
Is it fair to say it's a leading question? So, next question.
I guess what is the purpose of this training?
To introduce the individual, to introduce employees to the pathophysiology behind it, what was formerly known as excited delirium, and then how using ketamine as a sedation agent is effective, and then what the protocol is surrounding that.
Does it also educate the attendees on the restrictions of the ketamine use? What they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do with the ketamine?
I would say that the way a protocol is written, that it doesn't specifically say what you can't do, it can tell you what you can do.
If I could have 1 second, Judge.
Yes.
We talked about the training that you gave to Aurora Fire as well as to Falk, correct? This was the training that you're given.
Yes,
And those are both medical professional agencies.
correct.
Did you give this training to Aurora Police Department?
No,
Are they a medical agency?
they would be a police department.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
And for the record, I'll conditionally admit Exhibit G, subject to tying up the foundation for further witnesses. I don't know who they are.
Fair enough. Thank you, Judge.
All right, cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chambers. You mentioned a couple of things on direct I wanted to follow up with you about. The first comment that you made was that there was an understanding that Aurora Fire and Rescue has medical control to make decisions when they're on the same scene as Falk. Is that correct?
That is what the contract stipulates, yes.
Okay. And then you mentioned that there was no specific mention that law enforcement did not have medical control in the training back in 2019. Is that an accurate summary of your statement?
I believe so. I guess for the description of that, the police department has no direct bearing on medical control, so I don't want to state that they don't have it because that's not what the contract is agreed upon. The contract agrees between the relationship of the fire department and Falk that the fire department has medical control.
Right. And so when you say they don't have direct bearing, what we mean is that the cops don't, walk over to the ambulance and pick out which medications to give, right?
That is correct.
But they do have some effect on it because they're the ones that provide the initial information to the paramedics about what happened, right?
The provider may use at their judgment information furnished by bystanders as well as other first responders to inform their decision making.
Sure. And if you're a paramedic showing up to the scene, the first thing you got to find out is what happened before you got there, right?
Interject. We can approach.
Can you give me the general nature of the objection?
I'll give the same objection that was pulled against me.
And Judge, I'm just following up on the questions that he was allowed to ask, which are about medical and scene control and decision making.
Let's talk about the details of what the paramedics are allowed to do and not allowed to do.
Not ask about that.
All right, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Just making sure I don't have anything else I need to ask you about.
Sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult.
And I'm not trying to waste your time, just making sure. No, that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chambers.
Thank you.
Redirect.
Just to clarify, the question regarding the law enforcement not having medical control, not being specifically in a training protocol. They're not a medical agency. Fair?
The police department is,
This goes directly to his question.
Overall,
Thank you.
the,
Law enforcement agency, a medical agency.
I do not believe that a police department in Colorado, well, to the best of my knowledge, I do not believe that the Aurora Police Department is defined as a medical agency. I can't state that no police departments are because each department has its own responsibilities and people may have certifications. And I don't know whether or not what the department's policies were surrounding anybody with that sort of certification and what they could and could not do.
Perfect. But what you are aware is when Falk is called out for medical assistance by law enforcement, Falk has medical control.
The fire department does. And so if the fire department is not there and Falk is there, then Falk is responsible for those decision makings. If the fire department is there with Falk, then the fire department does.
Thank you. That was a way better way of me saying it. So if Falk is there with Aurora Police Department, Falk makes the medical decisions.
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
all right, may the witness be excused. All right, you may step down. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Your Honor, at this point in time, the defense would call former Sergeant Rachel Nunez.
Okay. You can step over here to my right and left, walk around the glass panels, and I'll swear you in. Solemnly swear or affirm that the truth is nothing but the truth. Yes. Right, thank you. Seated. I'll ask that you speak a little bit loudly or close to the microphone based upon the glass panels. And if you could please tell us your name and then spell your last name.
Rachel Nunez, Nunez.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am. Can you tell us, Ms. Nunez, were you formerly employed by the Aurora Police Department?
Yes,
Okay, are you now retired
yes,
happily?
sure.
Congratulations.
Thank
Your time with Aurora Police Department, well, I guess let me ask you, do I address you as Miss Nunez, Sergeant Nunez, former Sergeant Nunez?
Whichever you're comfortable with.
Your time with the police department, how long were you with APD?
Just over 25 years,
And of those 25 years, how long were you a sergeant?
15 and a half.
Prior to joining the Aurora Police Department, did you have any law enforcement training?
No,
So did you go through the Aurora Police Department for your training?
yes,
Is it fair then, oh, I guess, did you go through the training as a cadet as well as a patrol officer?
yes,
Do you recognize Nathan Woodyard?
yes.
Can you identify him, please?
He's sitting at the table with a dark suit and eyeglasses.
Why do you recognize Mr. Woodyard? Can you tell us your relationship with him?
Overruled.
Thank you.
Officer Woodyard was one of the officers assigned to my team
What does that mean that he's assigned to your team?
on patrol.
Can you tell us what that means when you're calling it your team on patrol?
There are sergeants that have anywhere from 4 to 8, I believe, officers assigned to them for their shift.
And so when you say that the officers, 4 to 8 of them are assigned to the sergeant, so this is your team that you're running.
Correct.
Do you remember about when he was assigned to your team?
I do not remember when I bid my shift for Graveyard Shift District 2. I believe it was the 2019 year. Would have been
So-
the end of January that started.
End of January. So could we safely assume that it's less than a year?
Yes,
With Mr. Woodyard or Officer Woodyard being on your team, does that mean you're his direct supervisor?
yes.
How close were you to Mr. Woodyard? Were you friends?
I consider the team like a family.
Does that mean that when you're off work, you hang out with him?
Not necessarily, no. But you get to know them and you care about them.
So when you say you care about them, are you talking about caring about them like a human being?
Yes,
Now, you as a direct supervisor over Mr. Woodyard, does that mean, I'm trying to understand what direct supervisor means. Does that mean that you're ensuring that your officers are properly trained?
yes,
Does that mean that you're ensuring that they're properly responding to calls.
Yes,
Does that mean that any job performance issues go directly to you?
yes,
Do you know a Randy Redeema, Officer Randy Redeema?
I know the name.
Was he on your team?
No,
What about Officer Jason Rosenblatt?
same.
Matthew Green?
He was an officer of the name that I know. I don't know him.
So when we're talking about a team, we're talking about you being more familiar with these officers than, say, other employees of the Aurora Police Department.
Yes,
Now, you being in charge of this team, as a direct supervisor, do you try to have them perform at their best?
yes,
Is it fair that as a supervisor, you're trying to ensure that they're not a liability out in the field?
correct.
Response,
I can rephrase, Judge.
please.
As a supervisor, do you want to avoid your officer on your team being a liability on the field? Doesn't suggest the answer, Judge.
Overall,
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
As a direct supervisor, are you trying to avoid your officers being a liability on the field?
Yes,
I want to orient you to the night of August 24, 2019. Did you see Nathan Woodyard that night?
yes,
Do you remember the look on his face when you first saw him?
yes.
Can you describe that to us?
I'm assuming that you mean on the call in question.
Correct.
His eyes were wide and he appeared to be shocked and surprised.
You mentioned that you know Mr. Woodyard for about less than a year, but close to a year since this time. Is that his normal look?
No,
What's his normal look like?
sustain.
I want to show you a video. If we could pull up Exhibit 192, this is Officer Dunson's body camera. And Mr. McCrae, if we could start this at, let me know when you're ready. $22 48 19. Okay. Go ahead.
You know where the
Is that you, Ms. Nunez?
with my back to the camera,
Yes.
could be.
Okay. Is that Sergeant Leonard?
I-
Dale Leonard?
I can't tell from here.
Yeah, it's a little bit blurry. I'll let it run for a little bit longer. Did you, it was pretty fast. Did you happen to see whether that was you or not?
I did not,
No
I'm
problem.
sorry.
Were you able to see the look on Mr. Woodyard's face in this scene? This is a perceiving witness, Your Honor. This is not a Verasia objection.
The court would sustain the objection.
We played a little bit more.
At least as to this part of the video.
Fair enough.
Y'all need help in
You
anything?
guys can give me wipes.
Wipes?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
You have a good grip on it?
He went like this, dude.
No, I'm good. Good to go.
Now, did you speak to Mr. Woodyard later one-on-one that night?
Yes.
Okay. What I wanted to ask you, and before you, I want to make sure this is okay. Did he have a similar look on his face when you're talking to him?
Yes.
Let's talk about the events leading up to you seeing Mr. Woodyard this night, okay? You can take that down for now. What was your role that night?
I was his supervisor.
Okay. Sergeant still that night, I'm assuming, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm guessing, were you on duty that night?
Yes.
So what does that mean if you're a sergeant on duty that night?
That means I'm paying attention to the calls for service. Want to make sure officers are going on their calls and they're handling the calls appropriately.
Okay. What caused you to go to Mr. Woodyard's area that night?
I believe it was the sound of the radio transmissions, sounding of a struggle calling for a supervisor and rescue.
All right. Can you describe to us when you heard that radio, were you trying to get to the scene or get to Mr. Woodyard as fast as possible?
Yes.
Were you the only sergeant on duty that night?
No.
Do you know who else was on duty that night as a sergeant?
The previous shift sergeant, Dale Leonard, and I believe there may have been another graveyard shift sergeant working with me. I don't recall.
Let's see. Were you trying to beat the other sergeants to Mr. Woodyard?
We were all trying to get there.
All trying to get there as fast as possible?
Correct.
Okay. Is there any significance to being the first sergeant that arrives?
Response.
Judge, there are certain protocols that I was going to go into, but I think it's absolutely imperative because we're going to be talking about who's in charge of the scene.
Well, if the witness can answer, I'll allow the witness to answer the question. So the objection is overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Is there any significance to the first officer arriving?
First officer or supervisor, sorry.
First supervisor, let's say it that way.
Technically, they would be the ones in charge, and then when another supervisor gets there, you discuss it together.
Okay. What's the difference between supervisor and sergeant?
There isn't.
Oh,
Supervisor, sergeant, that's who the supervisors were that night. We were sergeants.
I see. Sorry, the only reason why I was asking that is that you clarify when I said first sergeant to arrive versus first supervisor. Is there a difference?
No,
Okay. And so, did I understand you correctly that the significance of a first supervisor sergeant is who's in charge?
correct.
Are you familiar with that area of Colfax and Billings?
Yes.
Can you describe to us a little bit about that area?
It's mainly commercial. There's a highway interchange right there. There is low-income housing in the area.
Is it a safe area? Is it a dangerous area? This goes to her perception when she's arriving on scene, Your Honor.
The court will sustain the objection at this time.
Am I allowed to rephrase, Your Honor? or-
Sure.
Okay. Let me ask you, when you heard the struggle that prompted you to respond to that area, did you take into account which area it was?
Sustain.
Let's talk about when you first arrive on scene. If I could play your body cam, that's exhibit 180. And we'll just start from the beginning, Mr. Gray.
So.
That individual that came up to you on the right, do you know who that was?
I'm sorry, my screen went black at
Oh,
that time.
yeah, that happens. Can we rewind it about 10 seconds? Okay.
So.
Is that Sergeant Dale Leonard?
I saw a different officer go to my, oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
That on the right-hand side, yes, that is Sergeant Leonard.
Okay, so Sergeant Leonard being first on scene, that means that he's in charge of the scene. Is that fair?
Yes,
Okay. We see that he comes up to you to have a discussion. Do you recall the discussion you had with him?
I think the question was, did you have a discussion? So not quite yet.
Well, I guess let me ask, yeah, did you have a discussion with Sergeant Leonard?
yes,
Okay, without going into specifics, was he essentially debriefing you on the situation?
yes.
Okay. As a sergeant, did you require advanced medical training? I'm going to go into a directive here, Judge.
The objection's overruled.
Thank you. As a sergeant, did you receive advanced medical training?
No,
If we could show Exhibit B as in boy, page 4. B, Exhibit B as in boy, page 4. Okay. If we could zoom in, there we go. Under this directive, 1.47, are you in charge of ensuring your officers are kept up to date on trainings?
yes,
Do you require your officers to receive anything other than basic first aid training?
no,
Okay. CPR, that type of thing, right?
correct.
You take that down. Thank you. I want to focus our attention back to Mr. Woodyard that night. Back in 2019, was this before the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes,
Was it concerning for a man to be masked in that area?
Sustained.
We talked about the fact that you had a conversation with Mr. Woodyard that night. Did he come up to talk to you?
I don't recall the order of things.
4 years ago, fair enough.
Right.
Is it required that he report any use of force directly to you?
Yes,
Okay, as his direct supervisor?
yes,
Let's talk about you as a sergeant. If we could show Exhibit C as in cat. Okay, we could zoom in a bit. On that first sentence, it's fair to say that any lawful order given by a supervisor officer must be obeyed.
yes,
Okay. You are, on August 24th, 2019, who was Officer Woodyard's direct supervisor?
I was.
Under this directive, as a higher ranking officer, is it presumed that you and Sergeant Leonard are in the best position to direct personnel and tactics during an emergency call?
Yes,
Overruled.
Thank you. Would you like me to repeat the question, ma'am?
I believe my answer is yes.
Well, I want to talk about that a bit more. When directing personnel during an emergency call, do you take into consideration whether an officer is in shock during the call?
Yes,
When directing officers during an emergency call, do you want the officers at their best emotional state when addressing emergencies?
yeah.
Sustained.
What type of emotional state do you want your officer to be in when directing them during an emergency call?
I want them to be professional, calm, and ready to work.
If you see an officer not performing at their best during an emergency call, are you allowed to rotate out the officer?
Yes,
I want to play you a clip. If we can play Officer Dunson's clip at 192. This is at 20, let me know when you're there. This will be at 22, 50, 15. Okay.
So,
Is that his cell phone over there?
he's kicking around.
With a red case? Y'all missing your cell phone or
I'm
anything?
not missing mine. You used to be using the car, right? What's that? Your cell phone is in the car?
I think so. Is it an iPhone?
It is with a red case?
No.
Okay.
Was that you that came up?
yes.
Okay. Did you say something there?
Said his name.
I heard Woody, not Woodyard. Is Woody a nickname?
Nickname.
Okay. Was that him walking away with you?
Yes,
Okay. Just to reemphasize, can we play exhibit 175? This is Officer Woodyard's camera. At 22, 50, 20.
I'm not missing mine. Are you missing yours? It's in the car, right? Your cell phone? What's that? Your cell phone is in the car?
The iPhone?
With a red case?
Did we hear you there again saying the word Woody?
yes.
Okay. What does that mean when you're calling his name, when you're walking up to him calling his name?
I want him to come talk to me.
Is that an order? Are you ordering him to follow you?
I'm having him come talk to me.
Could he be in trouble if he refuses your order?
Technically,
So I've never been in law enforcement, so help me orient here. Tell me what it means when a sergeant walks up, when a direct supervisor walks up to a subordinate and calls their name the way you did.
that means you go talk to them.
I want to talk about what happened when you called him over. Did you guys walk away?
We did.
Did you just stay right in the corner in earshot of everyone?
I don't believe how far away we walked at all.
Did you have a conversation with him?
Yes,
When you took him aside, was it just the two of you or were there others standing around you?
I recall it just being the two of us.
During this conversation, did you perceive that he needed emotional support?
It,
This is for perception, Judge.
All right, I'll allow the witness to answer if she can,
Thank you.
rationally based on perception.
Based on your perception, when you're talking to him, did you believe he needed emotional support?
I believed he needed to take a breath, take a break.
Did he still seem like he was in shock to you?
Yes,
Did you provide him with peer support?
yes,
Was one of the reasons that you had this conversation with Officer Woodyard to make sure he could finish his shift?
It was leading.
Okay.
Rephrase.
In terms of the directive to ensure that officers are at their best, what was the purpose of you having this conversation with them?
Overruled.
Thank you.
I wanted to give him space, time to calm down and collect his thoughts.
Did you ever perceive that he was angry?
No,
Can you describe to us what you were perceiving when talking to him?
I just remember his eyes were large. They were big, as if he were in shock from what just happened. And I just wanted him to explain to me what happened in an effort to calm him down.
Okay. Was the purpose of you pulling him aside to scold him for using a carotid hold or anything?
Sustained.
Did you scold him at all?
No, I did not.
Got you. At this point in time, when you're speaking with Mr. Woodyard, was it your understanding that, I guess, what was your understanding with medical personnel and why they've been called?
That was my understanding, is that they were called and on their way.
Okay. In terms of timing with your conversation with Mr. Woodyard, were you guys just waiting for fire to arrive, or was there other things you had to do?
We were waiting.
At any point in time during your conversation with Mr. Woodyard, did you suggest that he should make a phone call or anything?
Yes,
Talk to us about that. Judge, this goes towards his location.
All right, well, that wasn't the question.
Well, I'm trying to get to there, but yes, I understand, Judge. So what was the purpose, I guess, what was the purpose of you wanting him to have a phone call?
And what's the relevance of her purpose?
Judge, if this is a deeply emotional phone call that he's making, he's going to want to find somewhere private to talk.
Well, now you're testifying.
Sorry, I'm happy to approach.
That's fine. You need to rephrase your question.
Let me rephrase it this way. You had mentioned that one of the reasons why you wanted him to talk to you is to step back, take a moment, take a breath. Was that also a reason for the phone call?
Sustain.
Why did you suggest that he make a phone call?
So it's not speculation because the witness would be testifying to her reason, but what's the relevance of the rationale of this witness?
It's the follow-up questions related to that, so it's more of a foundational question, Judge. and I'm happy
All right,
to
the court will sustain the objection.
To your knowledge, did Mr. Woodyard go anywhere to make a phone call after a conversation?
I know that he stepped down the street. I don't know if he ended up making a phone call or not. I wasn't with him.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you know how long he was away or on the phone?
I do not.
Now, there's been some suggestion that Mr. Woodyard abandoned Mr. McClain. I guess I would just want to be clear.
Sustained.
Did you order Mr. Woodyard to follow you, or did he abandon Mr. McClain?
Sustained.
This isn't the first time you've testified, is that fair?
Yes,
You've testified before under oath
yes,
back in 2021.
yes.
Were you questioned by this Attorney General's office?
Sustained.
Rephrase that. Have you described his demeanor, Mr. Woodyard's demeanor before?
All right, is this for impeachment?
This is for prior consistent, Judge.
All right, well, the credibility hasn't been impeached at this point, sustained.
I want to play you another body cam footage. This would be yours. Exhibit 181. And we'll play it from the beginning. Okay, stop there. Is this you returning to Mr. McClain?
Yes,
We had talked about this I guess, was this following your conversation with Mr. Woodyard?
yes.
Okay. You had mentioned that Mr. Woodyard had walked down the street. Did he walk towards everyone or away from everyone?
I believe his car was down the street or to the left in the middle of the street. I'm not sure exactly where it was.
Sure. Did you return to this area without Mr. Woodyard, I guess is?
Yes,
Okay. And so do you see him anywhere in this body camera? Perceiving witness, Judge.
Overruled.
Thank you.
I do not.
Go ahead and keep playing.
You can breathe.
Yeah.
You can breathe. You can breathe. Okay. I just have his on.
When you were there that night, do you recall hearing Sergeant Leonard ensuring that Mr. McClain could breathe? I don't understand what the truth of the matter is there.
Sustained.
Could I try to more for her state of mind? And so when you were there, did you obtain an impression that the sergeant in charge was ensuring that Mr. McClain could breathe?
Sustained.
When you were in this area at this time, were you cognizant of ensuring that Mr. McClain could breathe?
No,
Were you under the impression that others were? This is her impression, Judge.
All right. The court's going to sustain the objection based upon the form.
Okay. During this period of time, did you remember seeing medical personnel around Mr. McClain?
yes,
Do we see them here?
yes,
Okay. Is that what the yellow pants are?
yes.
While you were there, could you tell whether Mr. McClain was having any trouble breathing?
My focus was on other things going around.
Okay. What about during this period of time?
I don't recall.
Backing up a bit, since, so that conversation you had with Mr. Woodyard, I want to focus on, you had mentioned that you had provided him peer support.
Yes,
Well, I'm just trying to orient her. What is peer support?
Relevance.
Judge, what, don't want to testify. It's a foundational question because there's one that follows and I'm happy to approach.
I'm not, but I'll let you. All right, I'll allow counsel to rephrase the question.
Thank you. This conversation you had with Mr. Woodyard being at peer support, is that a private conversation?
Yes,
In fact, are there mandates with the Aurora Police Department that these types of conversations remain confidential?
It was leading.
Fair enough. Is there any directive by the Aurora Police Department regarding peer support and whether it should be open or confidential?
yes,
Did you, I guess, how do you know that? Were you part of creating that protocol?
yes, I was.
Judge, can we show the witness only 15.18? That's Bates 45666.
You may show it to the witness.
I'm sorry?
You may show it to the
Oh,
witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you recognize this, ma'am?
Yes,
Okay. Is this the directive we were discussing in place in 2019?
yes,
Is it a fair and accurate representation of the directive you helped create?
yes,
At this point in time, Your Honor, defense would move to admit, I believe it's Defendant's Exhibit H.
Or dire objection. And what's the relevance?
Judge, it'd be for the first sentence there. Fair enough. I could say it if you want.
Yeah, and then you'll be admitting the exhibit. Why don't you come up and let me take a look? All right, folks. I think it's probably a good time to take our mid-afternoon break. Don't form or express any opinions or discuss the case even amongst yourselves. Do no independent research, avoid any press coverage. I'd like to have you back in about 15 minutes. All right, the jurors have stepped out. The witness may step down if you'd like to. Be back in about 15 minutes. Find what we were looking for.
the paragraph starts with advisors must not enter into a dual relationship with clients, and then it continues. People's position is if the court's going to admit it, then it all comes in.
All right. Mr. Howe?
Thank you, Judge. Your Honor, in terms of whether that is a foundational objection, that sounds like it goes towards weight and not evidence, and that would be fodder for cross-examination, certainly. I don't have a problem bringing in the entire peer support program directive. I believe the previous objection with Chief Deputy Redfern was that this was not relevant at the time because we hadn't heard any evidence. We've now heard evidence regarding it. And so if she wants to cross-examine on it, I think that's fine. But if,
All right, well, the court would find that based upon the testimony so far, there's some relevance to the peer support program, but certainly the whole document needs to be admitted.
thank you. Do you want to hold on to that or do I give that to the clerk? I don't need a copy.
So I can give it to the court reporter, but should I just keep it for a little bit? Do you think?
I'm just going to be using that. So the court's happy. I'm happy to have the court have a copy there.
All right, I'll give it to the court reporter. I can ask for it back. I need it.
All right.
All right, our jurors are back. Please be seated. Ms. Nunez is on the witness stand, still under oath. You may continue with your examination. Exhibit H has been admitted.
Thank you, Judge. Ms. Union, we had stopped right around the time we were talking about the peer support program. Real brief, was that sort of your baby? Is that something you helped create?
It is.
Okay. Let's go ahead and publish Exhibit H, please. Exhibit H, please.
There it is.
Thank you. Can we zoom in on the first paragraph, Mr. McCray? Thank you. The point I want to try to make with Exhibit H is when providing peer support, is it meant to be confidential or open?
Confidential.
Okay. And understanding, is this the directive for a formalized program
Yes.
with the Aurora Police Department?
Yes.
Okay. Given that you were the one that helped create this program, did you also provide, I guess, informal sessions if needed? Do you want to respond? Sean?
Overall,
Yes.
Now, going back to the discussion you had with Mr. Woodyard that day, that night, was this an informal peer support type role you were playing?
Yes.
We saw in the video with you calling him over. The question I have for that is, during that period of time, given everything that was going on, why did you think it was fine to call him away?
overall,
Thank you.
There were several officers on scene, and that was, I felt at the time, a good time to call him away and have him talk to me.
Now, when talking to him and providing him with this peer support, given his confidentiality, did you want to be around other people that could overhear this conversation?
No.
overall,
Thank you. Did you walk far enough away where other people couldn't hear you and Mr. Woodyard?
as to the motivation, I'll allow the question, but not to the specific factual situation.
Thank you.
My intention was to pull him away from the crowd and talk to him.
And for your motivation, were you trying to be in a position where no one else could hear you?
Sustained.
Um, when you pulled him away, did you want to be around other people?
No.
When you pulled him away to have this conversation, did you maintain a constant visual of Elijah McClain?
No.
When you pulled Mr. Woodyard away, were you able to hear Mr. McClain from where you were?
No.
What about the other officers around Mr. McClain? When you pulled Mr. Woodyard away, were you able to hear them?
No.
I want to play you another body clip. This is 184. This is Sergeant Leonard's body camera at 22:58:55.
I imagine this guy's not even going to jail tonight, based on his, there's no way he's gonna. You okay? Yeah, I'm good. All right.
That person that walked behind you, is that Mr. Woodyard?
I'm sorry, I didn't get a good
No
look.
problem. Can we rewind it 5 seconds?
You okay? Yeah, I'm good. All right. So.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the conversation that you had with Mr. Woodyard, we don't, To your recollection, is it captured on body camera?
No,
Do you remember how long it was with Mr. Woodyard?
no,
Okay. Per Exhibit H, the directive with peer support, is it supposed to be recorded,
no,
confidential?
correct.
Okay. So I guess, do you know how long Mr. Woodyard was away from Mr. McClain?
I would be guessing.
Didn't have a
Okay.
follow-up.
That's fine. The witness cannot guess.
Bless you. Now, I want to play this clip a little bit more, okay? And I'm going to be asking you questions about Mr. Woodyard, okay?
Or Dima's camera got broken in the middle of all that.
Do we know where?
We already talked to the RP. We got the RP. What's that? That I don't. Did you lose your camera?
Yeah, it's by him, it's somewhere by him.
When Mr. Woodyard came behind you, do you remember him looking for things behind you or looking on the ground?
I believe he was.
Okay. Did you have a problem with him looking for something on the ground?
Sustained.
Does he eventually come up next to you?
Yes,
Did you have an issue with Mr. Woodyard standing with you and Sergeant Leonard? This is his direct supervisor.
Sustained.
From the angle that you were at, could you see any problems with Mr. McClain?
I don't recall that I was focused on that.
From the angle that you were at, could you see whether Mr. McClain was having trouble breathing?
I do not recall that.
From this perspective, who was closer to Mr. McClain, you or medical personnel?
Medical.
Now, I want to back this clip up about a little bit over a minute, okay, to 22:57:42. Go ahead.
He's drawing up ketamine right now.
Okay.
You want to give that before we?
Yeah, so once he gets out, I'm gonna hit him in the right shoulder.
Want some shears?
Now, regarding any discussion with ketamine, do you remember if you were present for that?
Sorry, I don't think that at that time I was paying attention to the conversations.
Yeah, no, that's fair. But my question was, were you present around Mr. McClain? This is Sergeant Dale Leonard's body cam,
Yes, I believe I was standing next to him.
and you saw yourself there. That was going to be my follow-up question.
Yes,
Okay. My question is, do you remember whether Mr. Woodyard was even present for that?
I believe he was standing to my right, but that's just what I recall from watching this.
Right. Let's go ahead and play it.
Want shoulder or ass?
Either way. just-
Ass is right here, man.
Give that a couple of minutes, we'll see if that works.
What's your A-frame, brother?
Yeah.
Just keep raising his legs. You good? You got it? Matt, you got his back leg here? Because I don't want him kicking you, man. What's taking so long here?
In terms of this view, is it fair to say that we don't see Mr. Woodyard beside you? I guess, do you see?
Sustained.
Let me rephrase. Do you see Mr. Woodyard beside you?
No,
Okay. As a sergeant, once fire arrives, does that mean that it's their medical scene?
Yes,
As a sergeant, would you allow one of your officers to interfere with medical personnel?
no,
As a sergeant, are your officers trained to defer medical decisions for medical personnel? That was poorly phrased. As a sergeant, are your officers trained to defer medical decisions to medical personnel?
are my off,
I'm sorry. Um,
I could rephrase.
Yeah, and I think we can assume that um, her role in her testimony is as a sergeant.
So in 2019, are your officers trained to defer any medical decisions to medical personnel? But this is her,
And it's been asked and answered as well.
okay, as part of your team though, right? So for, I'm talking about you as a direct supervisor.
we don't make any medical decisions in the field. That's not our role.
Thank you. If I could have 1 second, ma'am, Judge.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Those are all my questions.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon.
Hi,
Do you like Mrs. Nunez, Ms. Nunez? How do you like to be addressed?
whichever.
So I'm going to ask you about the night of August 24th, 2019, and you've already testified that you were a sergeant that night. Is that correct?
Yes,
But you had other duties that night also.
yes.
You were the watch commander, weren't you?
I was the acting watch commander and it was overlapped with, I don't remember if Sergeant Leonard was as well for his shift or not.
What does it mean to be the acting watch commander and a sergeant at the same time?
Means we don't have a lieutenant on duty, so the sergeant is performing those duties as well and taking care of the entire watch for the district.
And so since we are not all working for APD, can you explain to us what all those duties are?
Watching calls for service, making notifications up the chain, making sure that the calls on the road are handled and staying in contact with dispatch.
And all those things keep occurring whether you're at the scene or not. Is that true?
Correct.
And you also get forward the phone calls too, don't you?
Yes.
So do you remember this night, how many phone calls that you were receiving while you were at the scene?
I do not recall.
Typically, when you have been both the watch commander and the sergeant, is that a lot of phone calls?
It depends on the evening and how busy it is or what's going on.
This is a Saturday night,
Mhm.
usually a pretty typical busy night for law enforcement.
The day of the week really doesn't matter. Unfortunately, it's kind of the phase of the moon, really,
Or if the Broncos lost.
or one. I don't know.
Before you go out on a shift, there's briefings. Is that right?
Yes.
Could you describe to the jury what a briefing is?
A briefing is when all the officers that are working that same district and shift come together in one room at the very beginning. And we go over the supervisors in charge. We'll go over perhaps calls for service that happened earlier in the day that we need to be aware of. And talk about the different beat areas and what's going on there and get your assigned car.
That night, there wasn't anything concerning that had happened on the prior shifts as told in the briefing.
Correct.
Nothing was really hot at that moment in time.
Relevance.
Response?
Judge, I think it's important to note whether or not Mr. Woodard had, was told that there were ongoing concerns.
Hearsay then.
Sustained.
Is it important for officers to know if there are, have been ongoing concerns in the beat that they're working?
They should be familiar with the beat areas that they are typically assigned to.
Now, you've already testified that Mr. Woodard was part of your team
Yes,
and you had 6 or 7 people on your team, is that right?
I don't remember. It was either 5 or 6.
And you have described them as family. Did I
Correct.
understand that?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to direct your attention to when you responded to the area of Billings and Evergreen that night. When you approached, Elijah McClain was already on the ground, correct?
Yes.
And he was being restrained by officers?
Yes.
And he was in handcuffs?
I believe he was. I don't recall seeing that myself.
And there was nothing unsafe about the scene at the point that you arrived, was there?
Speculation.
If she knows, she can answer, Your Honor.
Based on her perception, the court will allow her to answer.
I believe that the scene was safe at that time with the amount of officers standing around.
And there were quite a few number of officers around Mr. McClain, wasn't there?
Yes.
And at that point, did you learn that Mr. Woodard had administered or put on Mr. McClain a carotid hold?
Yes.
And were you aware that another officer had attempted to do the same?
Yes, I believe I was told that.
And as part of being an officer at Aurora, you received training on the carotid hold, correct?
Yes.
And so you know that there should not be attempted carotid holds on the same person.
Objection. That's actually misleading. I think we heard plenty of testimony that it is allowed and that they're actually trained on it, and it's outside the scope, Judge.
All right. The objection to scope.
Well, Judge, this is cross-examination. We're talking about that evening, so I think I should be allowed a little leeway.
I'll sustain the objection.
Now, you've already indicated that you did not check on Mr. McClain to make sure that he was doing okay.
Correct.
Were you ever told by other officers that Mr. McClain had said, "I can't breathe"?
I don't recall at what time that was.
Sure. But would you remember being told that?
I don't recall.
Now, you have testified today that you pulled Mr. Woodard away because you wanted to speak with him.
Yes.
And defense counsel asked you that, was it a direct order? And you said yes. But you also testified that you did it for peer support.
Yes.
Now, you gave a sworn statement in 2021.
Yes.
And do you remember being asked about where you were when you and Mr. Woodard walked away?
I believe I was asked that.
And at the time, did you give your best recollection in 2021?
I did.
And do you remember saying that you were perhaps 20 to 30 feet away from Mr. McClain?
If that's what you're reading, that is what I said.
And you remember telling or testifying that you could still hear officers around Elijah McClain from where you were standing with Mr. Woodard?
I could hear them. I wasn't paying attention to their conversations.
And you also testified that you actually could hear Mr. McClain from where you were standing with Mr. Woodard.
I do not recall.
Maybe, please, sure, it's page 780. Can we pull it up for the witness? And it's line 19 to 22. If you could just take a moment and read that and refresh your memory.
Yes, I did just read that.
And is it true that back in 2021 that you stated, well, I can hear that officers were talking to him. I couldn't tell if there was conversation back and forth, but I could hear sounds from Mr. McClain. I don't know if they were words or grunts. I don't know.
Groans.
Groans. Thank you. Did I read that otherwise correctly?
Yes,
So you could actually hear Mr. McClain from where you were standing.
yes.
When you walked away with Mr. Woodyard, did you believe that the officers were taking care of Mr. McClain?
Yes, I did.
Did you believe that they had done all the things to make sure that he would remain safe while he was in their custody?
Yes, I did.
Would you assume that they would be following their training?
Yes,
Maybe we have the slide 201, please. Exhibit 201. It's already been admitted into evidence. Is it 202? Thank you. Ms. Nunes, I'm just going to have you direct to the screen. This is already in evidence in front of the jury. So when you walked away and you asked Mr. Woodard to follow you, did you make the assumptions that the officers had followed the proper follow-up for a carotid hold?
yes, I did.
So as we look at this, you made the assumption that they had already checked vital signs
Yes.
and they had already notified rescue
Oh, they had.
and they had provided first aid if necessary
Yes.
and they had checked for coherency.
Yes, I had believed they had done that.
You would never have asked Mr. Woodard to walk away with you if those steps had not been conducted, correct?
That is correct.
You also assumed that perhaps they had taken his pulse as part of the training.
Judge, I'm going to interject. Again, this is misleading. This is for individuals who don't regain consciousness. It's misleading based off of what she's trying to show.
All right, well, it's cross-examination. You can clear it up on redirect.
Ms. Nunes, I don't want to mislead you. Aren't these the steps the officer's supposed to take after a carotid hold?
Yes,
Did you know at the time that you were on scene that Mr. Elijah McClain had gone unconscious?
I was getting the information.
And did you ultimately learn that he actually did?
I'm sorry that he had what?
That he had become unconscious?
I don't recall if that was specifically told to me. I believe so.
Were you aware that he was vomiting on scene?
I don't recall that I knew at that time.
Is it fair to say that when APD has a directive, that the officers are going to follow those directives?
Yes,
And if no specific order is given, you expect the officers to follow the training
yes,
and the policies?
yes,
When a sergeant shows up, everyone doesn't just stop and wait until they get direct orders, right?
correct.
You don't expect them to stand around like robots waiting to be given an order.
No,
They must still do the right thing on their own, right?
yes.
I wanted to ask you a question about your perception. Defense asked you, did you perceive him to be angry? And you said no without hesitation. Is that fair?
Yes,
But you know he was frustrated, right?
I don't know if I would call it frustrated.
Did you see him walking around looking for something on the grass?
Yes,
And later on, do you remember Sergeant Leonard asking him if he was okay?
yes,
And do you remember what his response was?
I believe he said he was okay.
Well, the response is, I'm physically fine. I'm just frustrated. It is what it is. Does that sound true to you?
I have no recollection of that response.
If we showed you the body worn camera, would that refresh your memory, do you believe?
It might. I honestly don't remember that exchange until I just saw this.
I'd like to play Sergeant Leonard's body worn camera. Then we go to 230006 and play to 230100.
I just need to let them know that there's no lieutenants over around here, so.
Go ahead and
You all right, brother? Are you okay?
I'm physical. All right. Situation is a little frustrating. Is what it is. Okay.
Ms. Nunes, does that refresh your memory that that's what he said?
I still don't recall that, but I do see that that is on body camera.
Mr. Woodyard was dispatched as primary on this call, wasn't he?
Yes,
And then he also had 2 cover cars?
I believe it was one cover car with 2 officers in it is my recollection.
You are correct. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you remember after your conversation with Mr. Woodyard that he actually returned to where Mr. McClain was and spoke with Officer Rosenblatt?
I do not recall that. I
If
don't
that's-
know who he spoke to.
So if that's shown on body worn camera, would you have any reason to doubt that?
Not if it's on body camera, no.
And were you and Mr. Woodyard standing side next to each other before the ketamine shot was given to Mr. McClain?
I do not recall at what point of the night that was given.
So if it's shown on body worn camera, would you have any reason to doubt that?
No, I would not.
Do you remember whether or not Mr. Woodyard was assisting Officer Rodema when Mr. McClain was put up on the gurney?
I believe he was assisting. I don't know if it was any specific person. I think he was just assisting with Mr. McClain.
And do you specifically remember the fact that he got out his flashlight and was looking at the restraints?
No, I do not recall.
So if the body worn camera shows that, you wouldn't have any reason to doubt that.
Correct.
May I have just one moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Ms. Nunes, in the directive for peer support program, there's some ethical considerations involved in that, isn't there?
It's been a long time. I would think so.
The directive says that advisors must not enter into a dual relationship with clients. In this situation, would you be the advisor?
Yes,
And Mr. Woodyard would be the client, correct?
correct.
And the directive continues and says, these can include situations where the client is a subordinate. Was Mr. Woodyard a subordinate of yours?
Yes, he was.
It continues and says, advisors shall avoid situation where the client's need for peer review stems from an incident involving the advisor or any other situation diminishing the advisor's ability to remain objective.
Yes,
Did I read that correctly?
you did.
So that night, would the better option have been that he should have gotten peer support from someone else besides you?
I would agree with that statement.
As you've experienced watching the body worn camera, sometimes it's hard to see who is who.
Yes,
I'm just going to ask that we put up already admitted People's Exhibit 274. And this has been admitted, Ms. Nunes, but are we correct that the person we've identified as Mr. Woodyard is actually Mr. Woodyard?
yes,
May we please see 275? It's also been admitted. And once again, I just want to clarify, is this Mr. Woodyard without his hat on?
I can't recognize that person with it's just not clear to me.
Fair enough. I'm going to show you, just for the witness, 283. And it's just going to show up on your screen. Can you see it?
Yes,
And once again, is this a body worn camera clip?
yes,
And does it show yourself and Mr. Woodyard?
yes,
And are you appropriately labeled?
yes,
And this is a fair and accurate picture of you and Mr. Woodyard?
yes.
Your Honor, people would ask for People's Exhibit 283 to be admitted and published.
Questions or objections to 283? 283 may be admitted.
And does this clip essentially show where you and Mr. Woodyard were at the time that he said, he's physically fine, I'm just frustrated, it is what it is?
Yes,
I'd like to ask you to just show to the witness 276. Once again, same line of questionings. Ms. Nunes, is this a screenshot of one of the body worn cameras?
okay.
Is it? I'm asking you.
Yes, that's from a body worn camera.
And I've indicated that you were standing in the sidewalk street area and Mr. Woodyard. Are those placards appropriate and accurate?
I assume they are. That person has their back to the camera, so I'm assuming that's him.
Can't assume.
Earlier on direct, you kind of pointed out the same in the video.
With the movement,
Correct.
yes,
So based on what you saw earlier and this still, do you think that the person that is labeled Mr. Woodyard is Mr. Woodyard?
yes.
People would ask for omission of 276, Your Honor.
Objection or order?
Just brief, Woodyard, please.
That's fine.
Ma'am, have you had an opportunity to review all the body cams in this case?
Not recently, no.
And just in terms of the timestamp on that, are you aware of whether the body cams on each officer is matched up or synced up in terms of time?
They should be. They should be. The time stamps on body cam should be.
Sure.
They should be, but do you know if they are in this case?
I don't know that for a fact. You'd have to ask the body worn camera people.
Sure. Judge, with that, I have no objection.
All right, 276 may be admitted.
Ms. Nunez, do you have a lot of experience in the body worn cameras and viewing them for other cases? Just in general, do you have experience with what they look like and how it
Yes.
works?
Yes,
And is it fair to say that your camera sort of looks out in front of you? It doesn't look where your eye's looking?
that is correct.
So your camera may pick up what's in front of you, but won't pick up who's around you or behind you?
Correct.
During the conversation that you had with Mr. Woodyard, you knew at that point that MCU would be arriving. Is that right?
I don't know if I realized it at that time.
Could you just tell the jury what MCU is?
Major crime unit.
And the major crime unit comes out when a carotid hold is used. Isn't that true?
I believe so.
So a certain level of force, they will have to arrive and investigate.
I'm going to object. This is outside the scope.
Goes to his-
Response.
Goes to Mr. Woodyard's frame of mind, Judge, when he comes back to join the Elijah McClain scene.
Sustain.
During this peer support moment between you and Mr. Woodyard, was he aware that a continuing investigation was about to occur?
Objection, Judge. Outside the scope.
Sustained and asking the witness what was in somebody else's mind.
I'm not asking that, Judge. I'm asking what she told him.
Judge, can we approach?
Well, that wasn't the question.
That I can rephrase. Thank you.
Approach still, Judge.
Okay. He may rephrase the question based upon the court's ruling at the bench.
Thank you. Mr. Nunez, did you tell Mr. Woodyard that MCU would be coming out to the scene?
I don't recall if I told him that.
May we please show the witness, page 262, lines 20 to 23? Have you had a chance to review that, ma'am?
Review which, I'm sorry.
Review the lines of 20 to 25?
It just appeared on my screen, I'm sorry.
Certainly.
Okay.
And at the hearing in 2021, you said, and I wanted to make sure that he understood the administrative protocols for MCU coming up for this tier level use of force. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
And then you were asked, was this standard protocol for MCU to come out? And was it?
At this time, I really do not remember.
I'm going to have you look at page 263, line
Okay.
1. Let me know if that refreshes your memory.
Okay.
All right, and the court's ruling was she could testify to what she told Mr. Woodyard.
And I'll withdraw the question, Your Honor. Mr. Nunez, this has been a difficult, you have not wanted to testify in this case, is that correct?
Oh, I don't think anybody did.
In fact, do you remember speaking to an investigator with the Attorney General's office?
Yes.
And do you remember what you said that this investigation did for law enforcement?
I don't remember my words.
Do you remember you said that we had screwed up law enforcement, and so that's why you retired?
I don't remember the specific words that I used.
Would you like to see the statement?
No.
And then when the investigator from the Attorney General's asked to whether or not he could give you a subpoena, do you remember what your response was as far as what you could or could not believe we were doing in this investigation?
I honestly don't remember.
Do you remember saying that you could not believe what we were doing to her kids?
It sounds familiar.
So if the investigator wrote it in his report, do you have any reason to doubt his accuracy?
No.
Sustained.
I have nothing else. Thank you.
Redirect.
Ma'am, you were asked a couple questions regarding some statements you made back in 2021. Do you remember that?
Yes.
A couple different topics. Specifically, we're talking about February 4th, 2021.
Okay.
Fair to say this is about 1.5 to 2 years after the incident,
Yes.
and about 2 years ago from today's date, give or take.
Yes.
Now, I want to focus your attention on the line of questioning that Ms. Joyce provided you regarding the sounds and grunts or groans, excuse me, of Mr. McClain that you had testified about. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Can we show for the witness only page 780? This gives you, I want to show you the full page here. And I want to direct your attention to the statements that Ms. Joyce had made regarding your testimony back then. Okay, where you're talking about the saying that I can hear officers were talking to him. I couldn't tell if there's a conversation back and forth, but I could hear sounds from Mr. McClain. I didn't know if there are groans or words or groans, right?
Right.
Okay. And then the next answer you gave was, I was not near him that time, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then if we scroll down to the next page to 781, that's where you have the discussion of where you and Officer Woodyard were standing, correct?
Yes.
In there, you said that you were across the street, or if you weren't sure if you were all the way across the street by 225 or in the middle of the road.
Yeah, my screen, oh, there it is. Okay. Screen went blank for a minute.
No problem. That happens. On line 14, you're also saying that there's highway noise, correct?
Yes.
And if we scroll down to the next page with this line of questioning, if we look at the actual question that was asked on whether you heard these noises, line 8, the question was, so this is 106, Judge. This goes towards her statements. These are the statements that she was cross-examined on.
Well, not these specific statements, but the court will find that you can lead for rehabilitation purposes.
Thank you. And so in terms of the question that was asked of you, was it, so you were still able to see what was going on the grass when you walked away? Or were the sounds and observations that you made when you were up near Leonard? And was your answer, the observations were made when I was up near Leonard?
Yes.
Okay. And so in context from the questions that were posed to you, were you trying to explain that the officers, that you hearing the officers talking to Mr. McClain and the sounds and groans that you heard was when you were standing next to Sergeant Leonard?
Yes, it is extraordinarily leading.
Fair enough. Let me ask in terms of a more of open-ended question. What were you trying to convey when you said that the observations were made when I was up near Leonard? And we can provide you the full context too if you want to scroll back up.
Sorry.
You're fine.
I wasn't paying attention to what was going on the ground. It was the sights and sounds going on around me as I was watching the big picture.
Right. So I guess my question to you is in terms of the line of questioning that was posed, were you able to hear Mr. McClain while speaking with Mr. Woodyard, or did you only hear Mr. McClain when you're standing next to Sergeant Leonard?
It was when I was standing next to Sergeant Leonard.
And the question I have for you is that the impression that you had in terms of this line of questioning when you're answering the questions?
Sustained.
And my question to you is on February 4th, 2021, in terms of the questions that you were posed, that you were asked just now on cross-examination, was it your impression that you were being asked what sounds you were hearing from Mr. McClain when you're standing next to Sergeant Leonard?
Yes.
Oh, did you want to respond, Judge?
Yes.
Judge, I identified the date and time, identified the exact line of questioning. In terms of vagueness, I don't know how much more clear I can make it.
All right. Well, perhaps Ms. Joyce can make it more clear because the microphone is pointed in the other direction, so I can't hear. The objection was.
The objection is vague, Judge.
All right. Yeah, I couldn't understand it, so rephrase.
Certainly. On February 4th, 2021, this line of questioning, when you had said that you heard officers talking to Mr. McClain and you could hear grunts, were you under the impression you were being asked whether you could hear that when you're with Mr. Woodyard or when you're standing next to Sergeant Leonard?
Overruled.
When I was standing next to Sergeant Leonard.
Then I guess the $1,000,000 question is, when you were with Mr. Woodyard, could you hear Mr. McClain? This is redirect.
Well, that is vague because she was with
Oh, that's fair.
Mr. Woodyard a fair amount of time in different locations.
That's fair. When you were with Mr. Woodyard providing peer support, could you hear Mr. McClain?
I was not paying attention to anything else besides my conversation with Officer Woodyard.
Now, you were also asked a series of questions about your past statements made on February 4th, 2021 regarding MCU. You remember that?
Yes.
Directing, or if we could provide the witness only, page 262, or excuse me, 779. It's a couple different. If we can look at line 24, where you were asked, is it standard protocol for MCU to come out? Do you recall that line of questioning
Yes.
by Ms. Joyce?
Got objective when I try to ask this question.
Yeah, it was sustained too.
Judge, but she did go into it. This is,
No, she didn't. I didn't allow her to. I allowed her to testify exactly what she mentioned to your client.
okay. If I remember correctly, so you didn't really remember what you had told Mr. McClain, is that, or Mr. Woodyard, is that right? I'm asking for clarification.
Rephrase.
Sure. Do you remember what you had told Mr. Woodyard at that time?
I don't remember everything.
If I could have 1 second, Judge.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Those are all my questions.
Okay.
May the witness be excused?
Yes, Judge.
All right, you may step down. You're excused. Thank you.
Judge, can we talk, can we approach for procedural matters?
Yes. All right. There's a few times that I've been asked in my job to be the chief judge of when the real chief judge is away. And I realize that really my only decisions that I'll ever make is whether it's a snow day or not. And everybody always asks me that when I'm in that role. But it's not a snow day, but it's time to go home. So the court will release the jurors at this time. If you could be back at about 8:30, I'd like to get restarted shortly after that. Please remember, don't form or express any opinions, discuss the case, avoid any press coverage, do no independent research. We'll see you in the morning. All right, our jurors have stepped out. Anything else we could discuss, or are we ready to go for the evening?
I have some general anxiety about timing over the course of the next 72 hours, but that's, I don't think anything we can do anything about right now.
So do I.
Otherwise, no.
All right. The court will be in recess. Have a nice evening. Drive safely.